everyone, welcome to the fourth video of the video series on tissues class 9 science, and in this video we are going to introduce you to the animal tissues. I am Roshni from LearnoHub, the free learning platform where you can learn anything about math and science absolutely for free and where your concept becomes crystal clear. So in this video, as we talk about animal tissues, we will spend more time in understanding a specific type of animal tissue, which is epithelial tissue. So are you all ready? Let's get started.
Now, as I mentioned in the introduction of this lesson, that multicellularity introduced the division of labor. Multicellularity, that is the organisms which are made up of multiple cells, that is millions and millions of cells are present inside the body of the organism. So now the question was, how do these cells perform the specific functions? So the cells grouped together and they decided that they will perform a specific function. So this was known as division of labor. What is division of labor? It means that the entire work is divided into groups of individual. So every group is assigned a specific task. So this is known as division of labor, right? And this division of labor forms the basis or forms the basic concept of tissues, right? Now, if you think of it, the development, when a baby is born, when a human baby is born, the development of the fertilized egg to the newborn needs several rounds of cell division. Like, let us suppose if this is the fertilized egg, say this is the fertilized egg and this is the baby which is born. Now, in order to reach from this stage to this stage, the cell division takes place many number of times. In fact, if you go as per data, there are almost 41 rounds of cell division that actually take place for the development of a fertilized egg into a newborn baby. Now, cells which are produced, now when cell division will take place so many times, with each cell division, new cells will be formed. Again, with more divisions, more cells will be formed. Now, what happens to these cells? So, the cells which are produced, they take different pathways of differentiation. Now, some cells come together and they decide to become blood cells. Some cells come together, they group and decide to form muscle cells. Some cells together form the nerve cells. So this is how the cells which are being formed due to so many rounds of cell division, they specialize each of them. Right? So let us suppose so many rounds of cell division happened. So some cells forms the muscle cells, some cells form nerve cells, some cells form blood cells, some cells will form brain cells. So similarly, every cell will find out their own function. This is how the entire body of the baby is formed, and finally the baby is formed. So with the due course of time, the baby will get all the nutrients and finally it will develop the different organ systems, because the cells have clustered together to form a specific tissue. The tissues will cluster together to form an organ, and the organs will again cluster together to form the organ system, and finally the baby is born. So we see that cells group up and specialize to perform a specific function, and the needs of the body to survive is thus met. So this is how the organism is formed. From the fertilized egg, you get a newborn baby. That baby again starts growing up, it gets all nutrients, it eats properly. So growth and development happens in the baby. And as a result, the baby again with due course of time becomes an adult man. So if you see in that entire process, what is happening? Due to cell division and cell enlargements, growth is taking place. Right? Now, as cells divide, new cells formed, and those new cells again specialize themselves to perform a specific function. Right? So here now we will be talking about the tissues which are present inside the body of animals. So here again we will quickly look at the level of organization. So first level is cells. Then the cells group together to perform a specific function, forming tissues. Now these tissues will then form the organs. For example, here the lung tissues form the lungs, and the lungs will then form the respiratory system. Not only lungs, along with lungs you have many other organs. For example, the pharynx is there, the epiglottis is there, so, and kidneys are there. So everything together form this entire system, right? And these many such systems together, say digestive system, circulatory system, respiratory system, they together form the human being, that is the organism, correct? Okay, so with this, let us try to understand what we are going to study now with the help of an example from human body. Let us take the example of the breathing process, which we are all aware of because it happens as a part of our existence, right? We all know how we breathe. Now what happens? Have you ever observed that when you actually breathe, what happens? The chest muscles move. It is the speciality of the cells that they can cause the movement. Like you can feel it yourself. You try to breathe. So when you breathe, you actually feel that your chest portion is actually showing some movement. So how is it able to move? Is there some magic which makes it move or which makes it vibrate? There are some muscles present around the chest and those muscles move. So it is the speciality of the cells which make those muscles that they can cause movement. Right? Now when you breathe in, oxygen is taken in. Right? Now what happens? Now this oxygen which is taken in is absorbed by the lungs. Now the lungs are what? They are organs and they are also made up of tissues. Now the lungs will absorb the oxygen and it will transport it to the all parts of the body. Now how will it transport it to all parts of the body? Because every part of the body, every cell inside our body needs oxygen to survive, right? So let us suppose you breathed in, so you got oxygen. So the oxygen entered inside your body. But how will that oxygen stay inside your body? Lung will absorb it, right? Then it will be transported to the different parts of the body by blood. So what is blood? Blood again is a kind of tissue. So blood is also a kind of tissue. Now because of this blood, now the oxygen reaches each and every cell inside the body. Now what happens inside each cell? Inside the cell, you have mitochondria. We have talked about mitochondria in our previous lesson, right? So mitochondria generates energy in the form of ATP molecules using the oxygen. Correct? So this is how the energy generation will take place in the body. So did you notice the role of tissues here? Let us look at this example. Now here you can see this person breathes in. What happens when he breathes in? As he is breathing in, the lungs inside the body is expanding. Now what is causing this expansion and contraction? This is because of the muscles which are present here. Right? So the muscles which are present inside the chest, these muscles are made up of tissues, and those tissues are capable of causing movement. Right? So that is one kind of tissue which we name as muscular tissue. Right? So here you can see a role of muscular tissue. Now let us suppose you have breathed in, you have taken oxygen. The oxygen is absorbed by the lungs. Now what is lungs again? Lungs are again made up of tissue. Right? So there are kind of tissues which help in absorption. Now what kind of tissues are they? In fact, those tissues are again a kind of epithelial tissue. So here again you have one kind of tissue, that is epithelial tissue. Now you don't worry about the names. We will talk about the types of tissues in our next slide. Here I am just trying to tell you why are we actually studying about animal tissues, what all important role the tissues play, right? So now let us suppose the lungs have absorbed the oxygen. Now it has to reach the different parts of body. So here you can see that the blood is actually transporting the oxygen to different parts of the body. So what is this blood? Blood is nothing but it is a connective tissue because it is connecting the different parts of the body together. So here again comes the role of a tissue. Now once the oxygen reaches inside the cell, that means each and every cell has received oxygen. Now inside the cell there is something called mitochondria. So this mitochondria will generate energy in the form of ATP molecules, right? So how will mitochondria generate energy? Mitochondria generates energy in this fashion. It has glucose. So when the glucose will react with the oxygen, it will form carbon dioxide plus water plus 38 ATP molecules. And what is ATP? ATP is adenosine triphosphate. So this adenosine triphosphate is nothing but energy. So this is how energy will be produced by each cell. Now each cell will produce this much of energy. So you can imagine that inside the body there are so many cells and they all will produce some amount of energy, which when taken together will become a good amount of energy. Right? So this was just an instance, this was just an example which I gave you just to tell you that tissues which are present inside our body, they play a very significant role. Because if something happens to even one of them, the entire functioning of the body will get affected, because they are all closely related to each other. In fact, they are interrelated. Right? So with this example, we got some idea on the significance of animal tissues. So now, as we go ahead, we are going to discuss about the different types of animal tissues. We are going to discuss in detail about each type of animal tissues. Where do we find those tissues? What are the purpose of those tissues? Now, in most of the cases, I will be taking the example of the human body, because I feel human body is something which you will be able to understand in the best way, right? But as such, these concepts of animal tissues hold true not only for the human beings but for any other animal. So what are the types of animal tissues? Now broadly there are 4 types of animal tissues, that is epithelial tissue, connective tissue, nervous tissue and muscular tissue. So these are broadly the 4 types of animal tissues which we will be talking about in this lesson. So we will start with epithelial tissue and then go one by one with each of them. So I hope you are clear with the introduction of animal tissues, that why are we going to study about animal tissues, what are the significance of tissues inside an animal body. Now let us talk about epithelial tissues. So what are epithelial tissues? So these are the protective tissues. That means they actually protect all other things, and they are like an outer covering, outer protective covering. So these are protective tissues. They are covering of external surfaces, organs and cavities in body. Can you think of the most common covering of the body which protects everything which are present inside our body? The skin. Right? So the best and the most common example which you can think of an epithelial tissue is the skin. So if you look at the skin, it acts as a covering of all the surfaces of all the organs inside the body. It also acts as a protection for everything which is present inside the body. So what do you think our body is composed of? Our body is composed of so many delicate organs, right? So those delicate organs need some protection from the external environment. So the skin acts like that covering. It acts as a boundary keeping different body systems separate. So that means the epithelial tissue will actually, it is not that the skin is the only epithelial tissue. There are epithelial tissues which are present in some other parts of the body as well. So they actually act as a boundary keeping different body systems separate. For example, if we take the example of skin, so skin acts as a boundary between the external environment and the internal body. Right? Similarly, if we take the example of epithelial tissue which covers some of our internal organ, so that acts as a boundary between that organ and anything that is outside that organ. So it actually acts as a boundary, and therefore it keeps different body systems separate. For example, if we have a boundary between the between the lungs and the heart, so that boundary will separate the two organs, so it will keep the two organs distinct. So that is how epithelial tissue also act as boundary, keeping different body systems separate. So these are closely packed cells forming a continuous sheet. So closely packed cells, that means there are very less intercellular space. Now since the intercellular space is less, therefore the intercellular material is also less. Now the question is, why do we need epithelial tissues? What will happen if we do not have epithelial tissue? Let us suppose if we do not have this strong boundaries. Why the epithelial tissues are closely packed cells? Because they act as boundaries. Now, when you build a house, normally you build a boundary, right? Now we make sure that the boundary of the house is strong enough. Why? Because the boundary is the one which is actually protecting the house. Correct? So similarly, epithelial tissue acts as a boundary. So we need to ensure that the boundary is strong enough, and that is why the epithelial tissues are closely packed cells. That is, they do not have intercellular spaces. Now, what would have happened if they had intercellular spaces? Now, let us suppose if there are some intercellular spaces. So if there are some intercellular spaces, there is a good amount of possibility that the boundary would be leaky. That means the boundary which is made up of epithelial tissues which have leaks here and there. Now what will happen if you have leaks here and there? Let us visualize it in this way. Let us take the example of skin. Now the skin completely covers our body, right? Now let us suppose if you would have had leaks in between in the skin, and what will happen? The fluids, the blood, and all the things which are moving inside our body, they might come out of those leaks anytime, right? And that would be so yucky, right? That means the fluids or the waste materials or the bloods or the lymphs, whichever is flowing inside your body, suddenly from somewhere they might come out oozing. So that is why it is very important that the epithelial tissues act as good boundaries, and in order to be a good boundary, they should be closely packed cells with very less intercellular space, so that there is very less intercellular material, right? So this is a brief description of the epithelial tissue, which act as the covering tissue, which also acts as protective tissue, acts as boundaries, keeping different body systems separate, and they are also closely packed cells forming a continuous sheet. No blood vessels within these tissues. Now, what would have happened if there were blood vessels inside these tissues? That means, again, let us take the example of skin, because skin is something which is visible to us and which you can visualize in a better way. Let us suppose if you would have had blood vessels inside skin, not inside skin, within the skin. So the skin is an epithelial tissue, and within the epithelial tissue, if you would have blood vessels, in that case, what will happen? Let us suppose if somebody thumps your skin or somebody pushes your skin hard, then blood will start coming out, right? You will start bleeding. If your hand if your hand hits a hard object, right now what happens? You feel hurt, but even with minor exposure of skin to some or the other hurt, it doesn't start bleeding at once. Bleeding will start only when it hurts inside the skin, right? So if somebody presses your hand, it doesn't start bleeding, right? So if you have blood vessels within these tissues, in that case, what will happen? Even when your hand or when your skin gets hit by anything, it will start bleeding. It will start bleeding on and off for no reason. So we do not want that we lose so much of blood unnecessarily, right? So that is why the epithelial tissues do not have any blood vessels within them, right? Okay, so now let us look at the structure of the epithelial tissues. How do these epithelial tissues actually look like? Now, these tissues have no intercellular space or very less intercellular space. I already described why is it so. Because they act as boundaries, and we want the boundaries not to be leaky. We want the boundaries strong and stout. Now, when you look at the structure, you can imagine the structure of an epithelial tissue somewhat like this. So, it has two surfaces. One surface is free The other surface is the basal surface, which is attached to the basement membrane. So this is the epithelial tissue. These are the cells of the epithelial tissues, and the spaces between the cells, that is intercellular space. You can see this space, again this space. So these are the intercellular spaces. So these cells are forming the epithelial tissue. Now the epithelial tissue has two surfaces. One is the free surface. So this is the free surface. The other surface, which is attached to the basement membrane. So this surface of the epithelial tissue is attached to the basement membrane. So this is known as the basal surface. Right? What is this connective tissue? Connective tissue means it is showing that the epithelial tissue is the covering tissue, or it is the outermost layer of tissue. Now inside the epithelial tissue you will have other tissues. So here, for example, you have the connective tissue. So there is a membrane which separates the epithelial tissue from the underlying connective tissue. So that membrane is known as the basement membrane. So here that membrane is displayed in orange color. So the plane or the surface of the epithelial tissue which is attached to the basement membrane, that surface is known as the basal surface. The extracellular fibrous basement membrane separates epithelium from the underlying tissue. So this basement membrane is fibrous, so it is made up of fibers. So this fibrous membrane will separate the epithelium from the underlying connective tissue. So this is how, in a way, you can say that the connective tissue is also protected by the epithelium tissue which is present outside. Right? So this is how the structure of an epithelial tissue looks like. So now the next very important question, where do we find epithelial tissues? So we saw that epithelial tissues are covering tissues, protective tissues, so everything is fine. Now where exactly will we see these epithelial tissues? So if you look at the human body, you can find epithelial tissues at quite a number of places. For example, the lining of the mouth. So if you look at the mouth, so the inside of the mouth, the outer lining which is present, that is made up of epithelial tissue. Again, the skin, which is the most common example of epithelial tissue. The lung alveoli. So inside, what are lung alveoli? Inside the lung, you have small branched structures which are known as alveoli. You will study about that when we talk about the detailed structure of a lung. So even inside the lung, you have these epithelial tissues. Lining of blood vessels. So if you look at the mechanism or the functioning of the heart, you would see the blood vessels which are present there, right? So even on the lining of the blood vessels, kidney tubules. So even inside kidney tubules, so everywhere it is the lining. If you look at it, lining of mouth, lining of blood vessels, right? Because epithelial tissues acts as protective outer covering. So everywhere it acts as the outer covering or the boundary of that organ. Right? So these are some of the places where we actually find epithelial tissues. Not only this, there are some other places also. For example, the digestive tract, the sweat glands. There are so many glands which have epithelial tissues. So we will talk about each of them as we go ahead with the slides and as we talk about the different types of epithelial tissue. Right? So we are learning things one by one. So first we saw what is basically epithelial tissue, the basic information on epithelial tissue. Then next we saw the structure of epithelial tissue, how it is actually formed of. Next we saw where do we see epithelial tissue. So these are some of the areas where we actually find epithelial tissues. Now as we go ahead and learn more about epithelial tissues, I will also tell you why we see epithelial tissues in all these places. So there is a reason behind that also. Right? So now we will talk about the functions of epithelial tissue, and the functions of epithelial tissue which will actually tell us why epithelial tissues are found only in those specific places inside the human body. I mean, why is epithelial tissue not present everywhere inside the human body, and why is it present in those selective regions? So now once you understand the functions of epithelial tissues, all these questions will be answered. So the first function is it protects the underlying tissues and organs, which is very obvious because it is the outermost covering. So it acts as a protective cover for the underlying tissues. For example, the connective tissue which was lying under the epithelial tissue. So in a way it was protecting the connective tissue. Similarly, the various organs which are present inside the body like heart, kidney, lungs, liver. So it is protecting everything because it is acting as an outer covering. Regulates exchange of materials between the body and external environment and also between different parts of the body. So now since it acts as a boundary, therefore it also controls the flow of materials through the boundary. Let us again take the example of house. Suppose you have built a house and you have built a boundary, right? Now in the boundary you will have the main gate of the house, and you have asked a security guard to stand at that boundary, and he is the one who should regulate the passage of persons through that boundary. Now let us suppose some guests have come to your house. So it is the responsibility of the security guard to make sure that he allows only the correct person to enter inside the boundary, and he should stop the persons whom he thinks he should not allow. Right? So that means the boundary actually acts or actually regulates the exchange of materials between the body and the external environment. So in this example, which is the body? The house is the body, and external environment is the neighborhood outside the boundary, right? And so the boundary has to decide who will come from neighborhood inside the house and who will not come. So similar is the role of epithelial tissue. So the epithelial tissue also regulates the exchange of materials between the body and the external environment and also between different parts of the body. Now, when I am talking about an epithelial tissue like skin, then this is applicable, that it regulates between body and external environment. But when I am talking about an epithelial tissue, which is maybe the lining of blood vessels, in that case, it actually regulates the exchange of materials between the blood vessels and the other organs which are present outside the blood vessel. So that is why it is told between different parts of the body. Right? The next function, it absorbs food and nutrients. So this is again another important function. That let us suppose, again we'll go back to the same example. Let us suppose that some people have come, maybe the postman has come with some letters which is to be delivered to that house. So now the security person who is present at the boundary, it is his duty to take those letters and keep with him, right? So what is he doing? He is absorbing the required documents. So similarly in this case, the epithelial tissue will also absorb the food and nutrients which are beneficial for the organism or for that particular organ or for the underlying tissue. Right? So it also helps in absorption of food and nutrients. It secretes chemicals like hormones, saliva, enzymes, etc. Now inside our body, there are so many complex processes which keep happening, right? So you know that there are several chemicals like saliva. Saliva is the most common one, which I'm sure all of you are aware of. Inside your mouth, you always feel the presence of a fluid-like structure, right? So that fluid-like structure is known as saliva. Now, that saliva, why is that saliva secreted inside the mouth? Because it also has a purpose. It helps us when we chew food, it helps to make the food softer. So that is how it helps in breaking down the food into simpler substances, and thus it helps in digestion. Right? So that saliva has a purpose. Similarly, there are many hormones which get secreted inside the body, and these hormones are responsible for many characteristics present in a human being. For example, in a male body, there are several specific hormones which are secreted which give the male-like characters. Similarly, in a female body, there are many hormones which give the female-like characteristics in a woman, right? So there are different kinds of hormones, saliva, enzymes which help in digestion of food. So there are different varieties of such chemicals which are secreted inside the body and which helps the various processes taking place inside the body. So the epithelial tissues also secretes many such chemicals, right? So that is again another important function of epithelial tissues. So now if you look at these functions which the epithelial tissue performs, so you can understand the significance of the epithelial tissue. So not only that it acts as a barrier and protects the underlying organs, it also helps in exchange of materials across the boundary. It also helps to absorb food and nutrients. And now you will see that because of all these functions which it performs, that is why epithelial tissue is present in so many different types of organs, because everywhere, depending upon the function which it performs, it is present in different organs. So now things will get clearer as we go ahead with the next slide. Now when I talk of absorbing nutrients, I'll give you an example from the human body. I gave you an example, relating it to that boundary and house and letterbox. Now I'm giving you an example from the human body. For example, the lungs, right? When we breathe in, we take in oxygen. Now what does the lung do? The lungs absorb that oxygen. Now that means the main function of the lungs is absorption. So that is why the lining of the lung has epithelium. So now if the lining of the lung is made up of epithelium, epithelium will help in absorption, and that is why epithelial tissue is present on the lining of the lungs, right? Similarly, if we talk about absorbing food, right? Now if you talk of absorbing food, this epithelial lining is also present in the small intestine. Now small intestine plays a very important role in digestion of food. Now the epithelial lining which on the small intestine, what does it do? It absorbs the nutrients from the digestion of food. So when the food gets digested, you need something which should be able to absorb the nutrients, absorb the good things which are present in the food, so that those things can be utilized as energy whenever the body needs it. So the epithelial tissue which is present on the lining of the small intestine will actually help in absorbing the nutrients during digestion of food. Right? So now you understand why epithelial tissues are present in certain places and what role do they play.
So children, did you find the video useful? If yes, do not forget to share it with your friends so that they can also benefit out of this video. And I will meet you all very soon with a new video with a new topic. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.